Council in order for the Expediency Council to make a decision. That's one aspect of the Guardian Council. The other aspect of the Guardian Council is vetting the candidates. Vetting the candidates means what? It means that under the Constitution, there are certain laws about who is eligible to be a candidate. This is something that's normal in every country. You can't be a senator if you're under 35. You can't be the president, I think, if you're under 35 or 40 in the US. There are certain limitations on who can be a candidate for certain positions in every country. So, according to the Constitution, there are other laws which were then passed during the course of these 42 years by the Parliament, which are also part of the election laws in terms of who is qualified and who isn't qualified. There are also decisions made by the Supreme National Security Council that are also part of the laws that relate to who is eligible and who isn't eligible. So I'll give you an example of that. This is actually one of the issues that came up this year with some of the candidates, or one of the candidates. One of the laws that is passed by the Supreme National Security Council, we can talk about that as well, is that whoever wants to be president cannot have children who are residents of the US and Britain. It's a very specific law, and it's about who wants to be president, and it's about two countries. It's about whoever wants to be president of Iran cannot have children who are resident in the US or Britain because of obvious historic reasons, because it was America and Britain who had been the two countries who historically have been trying to dominate Iran. And so this has a real reason. There's a real actual point behind having this instruction that was given by the National Security Council. So that's what the Guardian Council does. It reviews the candidates for the presidentship. Now, under the new law, under the new election law, you have, for the local councils, it is the Parliament that is able to vet them, but those people who are not deemed qualified can appeal to the Guardian Council. So the point is that you have a place within the constitutional structure in which the vetting of candidates occurs. Now, usually, if you look at it in other countries, this is done in many countries through the party system, through the political party system. So, for example, you will have in the US the Democratic Party. Then somebody comes along, let's say Bernie Sanders. He runs in primary elections. Their primary elections take almost 2 years, take whatever, a year and a half. In those, he's able to get to a certain point, and then the Democratic Party decides that they're going to, whatever we want to call it, engineer, manipulate, work the system in a way that a person, let's say Bernie Sanders, in both 2016 and the recent elections, who might have a very large support base in the Democratic Party, is not able to become the candidate. I'm not saying that this is equal to that. I'm simply pointing out that in every system in the world where there are competitive elections, there is ways in which people get vetted in terms of becoming candidates. I actually think that the Iranian system is much more honest. It's actually very upfront about it. There are rules. If you don't adhere to those rules, you can't be the candidate. If you are going to be a candidate who doesn't believe in the basic tenets of the Constitution, well, obviously you're not going to be able to run. If you're a person who wants to be the president, and in Iran the president has to be Muslim, because that's the vast majority of the population are Muslim. If you're not a Muslim and if you don't believe in Islam, you can't be the president. So there are certain things that are based on they're not random. They come from a history. They come from certain experiences that we've had as a nation. And in the absence of a party political system, which I would argue is many times worse in terms of how it deals with certain personalities and people, you have to have a system where you have some sort of vetting. And that's what the Guardian Council does. Do I personally think that there are issues in terms of the laws or the length of time or the process that happens? Sure, we can argue about that. We can discuss that. But again, the issue is, do you disagree fundamentally? No, I don't disagree fundamentally with its role. Can we argue about the way it's implemented, or some of the details, or some of the procedures within the election law? Of course we can.
Thank you very much. Speaking of guarding council and the vetting system, I would like to appreciate the example of the United States is, I think, a interesting actually example. I remember during the recent primary elections, actually in the Democratic Party, when Tulsi Gabbard was running, she actually was doing well, and we know what her perspective is. Is usually against the mainstream politics in the United States, and she was actually outside. She was, let's say, expelled from the competition by changing the criteria for joining the debates for each time. It was supposed to be, for example, 2% or 4%
Actually, it's worse than that.
National polls, and they suddenly changed it in a couple of days before the one of the final debates, before the pandemic changed everything, and they changed the double the criteria, and she actually failed to achieve that. Was naturally something that would happen.
Well,
Because
actually,
no one could raise the ability or raise his or her position in the polls in just a couple of days. And so that is exactly the way they are vetting the elections. But as you said, dishonestly and without any clear actually position on that.
Well, actually,
there is another example talking about the guarding council and the role they play. There is one election in Iran which is not vetted by the guarding council, and you know that it is city councils. We are going to have them next week. With it's another elections going everywhere in the country. So we have city councils, or I don't know, village councils, whatever that we have about the local councils, and they are not vetted by the guarding council. And we have had the numerous cases of the problematic candidates. In some cases, they were actually charged with criminal activities, and I don't know. There were a lot of corruptions among them. I remember one of the cities in north of Iran, just recently, a few months ago. The whole council were arrested. The whole members were arrested, and so it seems that at least practically speaking, the vetting system is doing something that in the only election that it doesn't exist. We are seeing that the results are something that is against the democracy, is against the favor of against the interests of the public, and it leads to actually, as we are seeing, a lot of corruption in those councils. Let's talk about the city councils. Is there any points you want to make about that local councils?
Sure. Let me just add another point. I think worse than the example you gave is, again, the example that we had with Bernie Sanders, which is you suddenly have a thing called superdelegates in the Democratic Party, which is, where did that suddenly come from? And hey, wouldn't you know it, all the superdelegates are former officials, whether it's Bill Clinton or, Bill Richardson or whoever was senator or some sort of secretary. And so, again, the point is, I don't think anybody can point to a place in the world where you have elections where there are there's no vetting, or there's no filtering of the candidates. I can't think of a place. You might have some Swiss canton, with a couple thousand people who live there, where they have direct elections and by the way, in those Swiss cantons, it's only the males that can vote. Let's not forget that. So they assemble everybody once a year in some field, and they start asking questions, and they raise their hands, and that's how. That's direct. If you want direct democracy, that's it. So I think we have to distinguish between arguing about the principle versus how it's implemented. Yes, I myself might have things that I think are not done well in terms of the implementation of the election laws, but that's a different story than talking about the basics of it. In terms of the council elections, I think this was something that, again, like I mentioned, we didn't have it at the beginning of the establishment of the Islamic Republic for various reasons. We were in the war, and then we had a period where we were rebuilding, and so having another level or on a local level would have complicated the rebuilding of the country. But then once that period was finished, we had those councils being established. The councils, like I said, in a city like Tehran, it's very different. You have Tehran, which is a massive city, and so you have the local council basically being like a city parliament, and maybe the people don't feel it in terms of the direct impact of it in their lives. But in many of the rural places and many of the smaller towns and villages, it's a very important part of the way the village and that town and that rural area is managed. It's actually the main way that it is managed. So that is something that I think we have to, again, put in the historic context. We have to remember that Iran, in my lifetime, I was born in 1972, was in many parts of Iran was semi-feudal. You had 30% literacy, you had 70% illiteracy. You had in many parts of the country a system in which you had a feudal lord and you had peasants who were illiterate. And basically, whatever the feudal lord said, that's what happened. And so it is maybe one of the greatest achievements of the Islamic Republic to have those local and village councils, because it actually gave the least represented, the most deprived parts of the society the ability to self-govern, the ability to determine their local issues by themselves. And like any place in the world, I remember I lived in Massachusetts for a while when I was studying in the States, and you had basically one of the cities close to Boston having the same, because you mentioned the city in the north that happened, you actually had I can't remember what city it was, but it was a city close to Boston where you basically had the local mob take over that city. What ended up happening at that time, the governor was Bill Weld. He basically arrested the entire city council of that town in Massachusetts. And that town was put under the direct control of the governor of Massachusetts. So the idea that you would have corruption in the local level, I mean, tell us something new. That's something that any place in the world you look, that can happen, but that doesn't change the bigger issue, or that doesn't negate the bigger benefit, which is that within one lifetime you have a country which was semi-feudal, which the majority of the people, especially in the rural areas, were illiterate, becoming over almost 100% literacy. We have now close to 100% literacy in Iran, especially those who were born after the revolution. We basically have no more illiterate people. Some of the illiteracy that is there is still from some of the older people who are leftovers from before the revolution, but that's also very little. And those very people, within one generation, or 20 years, 30 years, went from being peasants and serfs who were basically bought and sold with the land. I mean, when I'm saying these things, people think I'm exaggerating. That's actually, if you look at the old contracts for selling land in Iran, you have, it says, land with this many peasants on it, rayat. So, we have a situation like that within 20, 30 years, going to a situation where you have literacy and you have those very people who were peasants being the people who are able to run in their village and councils, and being able to determine the everyday things that are important in their lives. Again, for those people who have lived in rural areas, who come from small towns and villages, they know what I mean. It's very often the capital might seem very far away from you, and who is the president and who is the prime minister or whatever might not be as important to you. Maybe the agriculture ministry might be important to you. but those other people might have less influence on you than the local council, which determines many things. So this is, I think, a very, very significant